Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Family Matters. We're heading to Australia this time to actually someone my wife and I know very well. He's actually been a pastor here in Auckland, in fact the church that we attend, the Upper Room, if you want to know that particular secret, although I suspect it's not really a secret. But we're going to be talking to Dr Craig Heilmann. So first and foremost, Craig, great to see you again.
Simon, great to see you, mate. It's always lovely to hang out with you.
So for me, you're sort of in the best of ways, a bit of a yo-yo in that you're an Australian who came to New Zealand, obviously led the Upper Room, the church in Auckland for many years. And now, if you will, the yo-yo analogy, you're back in Queensland and starting a new life and career there.
Yeah, correct. So we do still travel back a fair bit to New Zealand and do a fair bit of ministry there. But most of it these days is in Australia. And yeah, it was just got to the end. We planted the Upper Room 15, maybe 16 years ago, and felt like after 15 years of leading it, it was time to hand over to someone younger. And so just decided there was one more thing I wanted to do before I end my ministry career, whenever that ends. So that seemed like a good place to head back to Australia and minister there. So that's what we've done in the last year and a half, 2 years.
I want to actually ask you a little bit about your new ministry, because I know it's not just, if you will, in Queensland there in Australia. You're also doing a Substack, you've got a website. But I just wanted to signal to people tuning into the podcast, I've got Craig on because actually he put an amazing, I thought, Substack on around the paradox, as I would describe it, of a modern secular world which pushes against Christianity, that says it's no longer relevant. And yet, Craig, you write about how actually people are refinding faith, particularly younger ones, are coming back into the church. So we're going to explore that Substack and that paradox. But before we delve into that, tell us what you're doing, Craig, or rather tell the listeners, because strange enough, I know what you're doing.
Well, Simon, we moved to Queensland. My family are all in Queensland, so it seemed like a natural fit for us to be here. So what we did was set up a ministry when we got here called Faith Made Public. So our website is faithmadepublic.com, and the Substack is faithmadepublic.substack. And so what we're trying to do is inspire Christians to be confident about being Christians in the public square as it is today. And our public square is extremely confused, as you know better than me, having had all that experience in politics. But it's a bit of a mess. But in the midst of that, I think it's time for Christians to realise that the only force for renewal within Western civilization, realistically, is actually Christianity. That the roots are so deep in Western civilization of Christianity that really, even though the church is small and powerless in many ways, it's actually the only force that can renew the civilization. Islam can't do it. What Islam could do is set the Western world on a different footing, but it could never renew what was built within it. You need a Judeo-Christian heritage for that. In fact, you need a whole bunch of Christians. And so the surprise for me, mate, in coming back to Australia, because I left Australia when I was 18 years of age, and I've pretty much lived all over the world, including 25 years in New Zealand, to my surprise. Married a beautiful Kiwi lady, obviously. But to my surprise, coming back to Australia, when I left at 18 back in the early 1980s, if you'd believe the sociologists and the people on TV and in the media, there'd be no Christians in Australia in the year 2025. I've come back in the last couple of years, and shockingly what I've discovered is the church is growing and thriving and doing extremely well. That has come as something of a shock. And Australia, far from being an irreligious country, is a highly religious country. Not always Christian, but very religious, full of religious people seeking spiritual experiences, and full of other religions now and all the rest of it. It's a spiritual melting pot in many ways. But what you discover is the average punter's looking for spiritual encounter, and they're looking for hope, I think, and they're looking for relationship and community. They're looking for what traditionally faith communities have always offered us.
I've just actually I warned you before you're coming on, I always go off on tangents. So you've clearly been surprised there's more belief. Is it within the mainstream religion? So you mentioned Islam, Christianity, let's say Sikhism, Buddhism, or is there still sort of that new agey, wider theistic? Lots of that. Yeah,
lots of that. Lots of the new age stuff. But the bit that's interesting for me, and we baptised a lady yesterday who I was preaching at the Hillsong Church in Noosa about, 10, 12 weeks ago, and this lady put up a hand when we gave the appeal for people to come to Christ, and she gave her heart to Christ that morning, and we got the chance to baptise her yesterday down in the Noosa River. and which was beautiful. And she came out of the New Age movement, and she introduced me to a new friend who she started to bring into church, who's also a New Ager. And then the lady that walked down the stairs with her that morning when I prayed with her and we led her to Christ was also someone that came out of the New Age movement. So surprisingly, what we're seeing is a lot of people are realizing that what they thought they'd find in the New Age movement was something spiritual. All they found at the bottom of it was themselves. And they were exhausted with the efforts they were making to be spiritual people, and discovered that, in fact, returning to the church with its message of God's grace coming to us freely in Jesus Christ is a liberating message. So we're seeing a lot of New Age people return to the fold, and we're seeing a lot of people that maybe had Christian roots. Maybe they grew up in a Sunday school or their parents had faith or whatever. Those people returning to church, and often people who've lost all hope. So in my church about maybe 6 weeks back, there were 4 guys fresh out of prison who all got saved on the same night and were baptized a few weeks later. But this is not like, I'm not talking about one church. I've probably been in 30 different churches over the last 12, 18 months in Australia. And we will have seen people saved in every church. Doesn't matter where it is. I'm going to tell you another story. Tiny Baptist church in a place called Bulimba in Brisbane. I sat with the pastor, lovely guy, Pastor Joe, told me that his church for the last 10 years has been a church of 30 people. After Charlie Kirk got shot, the church has sprung up to 100 people attending. That means about 70 new people have started coming back to church since Charlie Kirk got shot. Now, I'm not suggesting what the sociological connection is between those facts. I don't think I'm smart enough to know. But something spiritual is happening. And I'm just registering it. And in the Substack, that's what I do, is I just register that something's shifted, something changed. And we see it all the time now. Definitely in Australia, we're seeing it all the time. And part of that Substack, mate, is a bit of a reflection on my life journey, because the early part of my life preaching the gospel of Jesus, it was probably hard to see people coming to Christ regularly. You know, we had to work a bit harder to tell people about Jesus, because there was a lot of resistance to the church, and the church is full of hypocrites and they just want our money. And the other thing of, my parents used to believe that sort of stuff, but I could never believe it. And hey, religion's a crutch and who needs that anyway? You don't sort of see that anymore. You don't encounter that. What you encounter are people who have never heard of Jesus and have no bitterness toward the church. And it's so post-Christian now that there just seems to be a different possibility for the messaging of the gospel today.
Yeah, well, we're seeing around the world actually a number of people who were either atheists or very agnostic turning to faith in quite remarkable ways. And you end up also with Richard Dawkins, that evolutionary biologist and radical atheist, speaking actually a bit like you were at the start in terms of the Judeo-Christian foundations of our Western society. Yeah. And I'm sure you've read Tom Holland's book Dominion. I mean, he posits that very, very strongly as well. And so there does seem to be a curiosity, and I can report even back here in little old New Zealand, there's quite a number, particularly of young men. It's not exclusive, but a number of young men that have been quite affected by the Charlie Kirk shooting. And I don't know, I'm always remembered by says me to the man who's got the name, or not the name, the prenominal doctor in front of him, but of course the great church father Tertullian, who talked about the blood of martyrs is the seed of the church. And, there's just something's happened around the Charlie Kirk shooting, among other things. That seems to have drawn, are you seeing that in Australia, a lot of particularly young men, or is it a lot of women too?
A lot of young men, you're right. And we were seeing it across the board, but it's definitely more young men than there would be young women. In fact, if I was to have a stab in the dark, I'd say I think the young women are still a bit more liberal than the young men. The young men seem to be looking for a more conservative message. And there's a dark side to this. There's a negative side too, because there is a lot more, particularly in America, I won't speak so much about Australia, but it's here too. There's a lot more of this sort of what you'd call a white Christian nationalism, or a sort of a Christian nationalistic thinking that's very odd and not very Christian, in fact, not really Christian at all, and unnecessary, and probably a distraction from the gospel, definitely a distraction from the gospel. So there is some of that going on too. There's some negativity, but by and large, I'd say it's a positive thing. The churches are filling up again with people. It's all ages, but you're right, it's young people. I mean, the UK is the one that's been the most obvious in terms of young people, is literally statistically, I think, according to the research from I think it was the Bible Society in the UK, but something like a couple of million more young people attending church today than there were 10 or 15 years ago. I don't know if we could say that's happened in Australia yet, but something's happening for sure. There's a change in the water.
Well, again, you're very connected here, of course, to New Zealand. You've only left recently, but there is that change here as well, which is why, again, just going to call up your Substack, because it was, again, when I read it, and I loved it, and I encourage viewers and listeners to go and look up Craig's name or Faith Made Public. You'll find his Substack. But it was the one that you wrote. It's entitled, and you know what it is, Craig, but viewers won't, but it's The Strange Return of Faith at the End of the World. And you start really talking about, as it says here, the great separations of the church from the state, self from society, money from morality, and people from tradition. And I just sort of really, it echoed something quite fundamental, and I would argue, in the human condition, that actually we have, through and post-enlightenment, for all its benefits, separated so much of what we were to, I would put as a false promise. And I'll let you elucidate more on it, but there was one line I just loved, and it was, where monks once prayed through the night for the world's well-being, government bureaucrats now toil under fluorescent lights, drafting better policy manuals. I just thought that was gold. yeah, I've been doing both.
You know both sides of that better than I do. I mean, there is, let's face it, we once lived in a world lit by fire, which some people think is a terrible thing, and some of us think actually was perhaps a better time in many ways. Look, there's something missing in our society is what we're pointing to, and these separations are modern separations. The idea that me, my little self, and whoever I think I am inside is completely separate from the people around me, that's a modern idea. The idea that the money market and the market that rules us has no sort of ethical content to it, that's a modern idea. The idea that church has nothing to say to state, and state dominates everything and can tell the church what to do, that's a modern idea. There's all of these separations that have happened that we take as normal now as modern Westerners, that are not normal historically for any community, certainly not for the Western world. And for those of us, I read medieval theology when I was training, doing my doctorate, and I still read people like Thomas Aquinas. And to me, the world that they inhabited was in many ways a much more healthy world. It was a much more healthy worldview that they possessed. So we have to deal with all of these separations. You can talk about God, but you can only talk about him over there because that's been separated from public life. All of these weirdnesses are modern, and they're not healthy for us as human beings. But in my Substack, that's what I'm trying to say is, look, all of these things that we thought were going to drive God out have actually created a hunger for God in human beings. And so God's making a comeback by these very forces of separation. So I don't think that, if you'd been raised in the 1960s at a university anywhere in the Western world, you'd have been indoctrinated from then through to the early 90s with something we call the secularization thesis. This is where the really smart sociologists told us that Christian faith would disappear, that all faith would disappear, religion had no place in the modern world. After the 1990s, particularly with the rise of Islam and what the war against terror and all the rest of it, but with globalization and many other factors, including the growth of modern Pentecostalism, all of these factors taken in, sociologists became far more sober about this and said, actually, faith isn't going to disappear. It's going to remain as a constant. And in fact, it's now growing. This is the truth. I mean, Australia is a more religious country today in 2025 than when I first left as an 18-year-old in the early 1980s. So it hasn't disappeared at all. Now, that's not to say it's all Christian faith. Of course, there's Islam, there's Buddhism, there's all the rest of everything that's been imported with our enormous immigration that we do. But it's created a very interesting conversation in our public square where religion, pretty much any mainstream story that's going on today in Australia, you'd be surprised how many of those stories have a religious note to them. It's quite surprising.
Yeah, well, even if you look at films and movies, a lot of them are actually falling back to pretty much Christian ideals tucked deeply within. I mean, it's not so recent, but one can think of the Lord of the Rings or the Narnia series, for example. It's probably not the great Christian example, and it's a bit older too, but, The Matrix really is just Plato's allegory of the cave, which, of course, seeing you read Thomas Aquinas for fun and, just relaxed reading, that it's very much a Platonic and Aristotelian basis. I suppose putting you are a theologian. In some ways, this paradox isn't really a surprise. I mean, 2,000 years ago when they put Christ on the cross, they thought they'd killed him and done him in, to put it without much subtlety. And yet he turned it round. I mean, Christianity is all about paradox. And so is this really just a continuation of that very dynamic?
It is. It's a surprising continuation of the resurrection power of Jesus. And I think, one way to think about this is I call it the return of human nature. I think the modern liberal world that we live in has been completely unrealistic about what human nature is. I mean, let's face what it is to live in a liberal society like we do. And you've been in Parliament, so you know the system better than I do. But we basically have created the biggest levelling experiment in history. We've tried to literally destroy all hierarchies in our society. And of course, the family was one of the first, places of attack and assault. So assaulting what role a father might have played traditionally in a family with the view to levelling this institution so everybody was equal before the law and all the rest of it. The problem is in human nature itself that we actually are not the isolated individuals that modern liberalism sees us as. We're essentially communal beings. I mean, we only had to read Aristotle 400 years before Jesus or 350 years before Jesus to realise that man is a social animal and political animal. We're made for relationships with others. We're made for community. So human nature just continues to re-emerge. And no matter how much the modern Western world tries to isolate us and pretend that we're these isolated atoms, completely unconnected to everybody else except by contract, the truth is that's just not what a human being is. Imagine, you know philosophy better than I do, but imagine Descartes sitting in his room by the little fire and he's placing everything he thinks he knows in doubt all at once, except he never doubts that he's thinking in French or he's thinking in Latin, which are the languages he inherited from his family and his education. He never places that in doubt because you can't think except by a language. You don't get a language unless you're part of a tradition. You're part of something bigger than yourself. Your parents had to pass it to you. So this idea of the isolated human being who just arises in history, each of us like out of an egg birthed from nowhere, and then we get to make up for the rest of our lives what we are, is a nonsense. And human nature for sure will bounce back and go, sorry, I can't believe that lie. I can't swallow it anymore. I need more than what the modern Western world is offering me.
Well, as you've stressed, obviously here, but also in your Substack, so much of the modern world is self-focused and selfish. And for me, it's the opposite of humanity, which is relational. And I want to tie this to the Christian tradition too, because it's not my original thought, but we're all born into relationship. From the moment we're conceived, we are son to a mother and then son to a father and siblings. We're always in relationship, despite what the modern world says to us. But I think that's one of the key elements that I would argue differentiates Christianity from many of the other mainstream religions, because it is a relational religious tradition. Buddhism, for example, I have to say, an incredible rich tradition, but it's very much a focus on self. But Christianity is relational, obviously with the person of Christ, but also with the church, others.
Yeah, that's right. And look, theologically, if you think about what's claimed in John's Gospel about Jesus, that the Logos, the form through which God created all things, has become flesh and pitched his tent or dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So we learn a very, very interesting fact about grace, is that grace in the Christian tradition is particular. It's particularized to a concrete person who brings it into the world, and it's through relationship with Jesus that we get access to grace. It's not a generalized religious effort or self-help program of make yourself better and pull yourself up by the bootstraps and do better. This is about a relationship with a person who makes our lives possible, puts us back in touch with the source of our lives, the creator who made us. And that's, I think, where human nature is rebounding, because we're simply unable to live without that awareness of our creator. And it's through Jesus that we get that back. And not only do we get the relationship with Jesus, we get a relationship with a whole new family called the church, which I've always loved. I've always loved the fact that, it's not just me and Jesus against the world. I get with the gift of grace a whole family and community called the church. And it's also part of my salvation to be part of the church. That's how my formation, my sanctification, everything's occurring, is through the journey that I'm on with the people of God through this world. And so these things are, you and I know this very well, these things are so critical to our experience as Christians. And that's why I think we're ultimately a very blessed people, because when you have a crisis, if you belong to a church and you have a crisis, you're never left alone on your own resources. But if you look at the average person in the world these days, they can feel very isolated and very alone very quickly, and very cut off from the sorts of resources that would help them. And all they can turn to is that massive bureaucratic big brother called the government. And more in Australia and New Zealand, that's where we're looking now. Our problems have become so big that it's always to the government that we're looking, and we seem to have no mediating community anymore to help us buffer, which also means we have no protection against the government when it decides to do stuff to us, which is also scary. And I think you, as a Catholic philosopher and theologian, know better than me those mediating structures. Protestants have done a lot to destroy them, but I think the Catholics have done a better job of understanding and standing up for those mediating structures.
Yeah, without turning this into an ecumenical fight, I think the point you make is quite correct. In fact, we've seen the ever-growing power of the state, which has seen not just religious but wider civil society damaged. I'm quite struck. I'm sure there's been the horror stories in Australia, but when terrible things happen to children here in New Zealand, for example, the people start blaming the government. And it's like, well, hold on a moment. There's a whole lot of other, individuals, family members, wider whānau that we should be, thinking about. I know that's phrasing it more in the negative, but there is a really important place for religious traditions, for charities, for civil society, but they're becoming very, very weakened, I'd say, across the Western world now. And I do like what you say, because, of course, it's not as if that power to do good disappears. It's just taken on board by the state. I would say from personal experience, it doesn't do it very well or effectively. But, we only need to look back a couple of years for the great crisis beginning with C. Feels like a bad word now. But the enormous power of the state that was just exercised, and there really weren't, I assume your own view, there weren't really the civil structures to push back.
No, it was brutal, and it exposed just how weak and frail the citizen is before the big behemoth called the state. And it was a scary time, and I think what it shows you is the problem. Now, look, we know where this goes because we've read Hannah Arendt, right? And we know that her study of totalitarianism tells us, and there are other studies, obviously, but her famous book on totalitarianism asks the question, how did something like the Nazi phenomenon in Germany happen? Well, she said enough people were isolated from one another that the state became the answer to everything. And so we know that as the citizen gets smaller and more fragile and more isolated from fellow citizens, which is why we need the mediating structures of civil society. We need our family, our churches, our clubs, our, all these connected places and the larger institutions that could mediate and stand up to something as large as the government. We don't have it anymore. It's just you versus the state. It's me versus the state. And someone, a wag, Alistair McIntyre in philosophy, once said that being asked to die for the modern state was rather like being asked to die for the electricity company. You're prepared to die for your family and your friends and your neighbours and the people you live with in your town because you know them and you love them. But if the electricity company came along and said, die for me, you'd be thinking, why am I doing that? Well, that's what it's become like with the modern state, this faceless monster that we're always dealing with, is always in our lives, but we're not connected to deeply, and so we're unprotected from it as well.
I think it's one of the big challenges, not only when we have seen decline in the church, but also in volunteerism in sports clubs. Arguably, and I'm theorising as we sit here, arguably too, as people spend more time on their devices, that's not that deep, genuine human relationship. And as you say, that doesn't actually bode well for a society and a community. So it strikes me that the church has actually a really important role here to play, to not only draw people together, but to get that message out. Although I fear at times, and I'm asking you as much as a pastor, as a theologian, but I come across too often, we talked about it before off the camera, which is that moral Western therapeutism. So really the Christian teaching from some churches, and it goes across, not just Protestant, Catholic as well, and others that are very much, well, I've got to help myself, really faith is just the self-help cause, and until I heal myself, how can I help others? And it just strikes me that's the antithesis of the Christian and the gospel message.
It is, because the gospel is supposed to be liberating of my human, the possibility of my human nature, and it's supposed to cause me to flourish. It's not to leave me in perpetual victimhood. And we did it. Kim and I did a seminar on parenting and Gen Zs and things in a church in Australia recently. And sadly, one of the things the pastor said to us was, "Look, it's great you were able to tell people how to look after their kids and do certain things, but," he said, I just want to remind you that the parents themselves are in a position where they think they still need to be parented." And that's something we hadn't thought through for ourselves, was that because of the therapeutism of our culture, everybody's got issues and So you often find our parents don't have time for their kids because they're still dealing with their own stuff. And yeah, there's something missing in that. And look, we've all been tempted to it for sure, because you deal with people continually who want to use those therapeutic categories and therapeutic language. So in order to communicate, you'll often drop into those categories. But arguably, after being in ministry for a long time, like I have, and I'm sure you have, you probably realise that's not that helpful. And it takes me back to that wonderful sociologist and philosopher Philip Reef, who was the first to warn us that we were changing from being a religious human being to being a therapeutic human being. In the book called The Triumph of the Therapeutic, I think it was 1965 or 1967 when it was published. Excuse me, fantastic book. And The Triumph of the Therapeutic, and he said, look, we're basically producing generations now of therapeutically minded human beings who just, what did Reef say? That religious man was born to be saved, and therapeutic man was born to be comforted, or born to be pleased, something like that. And so that's what we've become. And now our churches, people enter our churches and demand that we minister to that. And I think there has to be a return to the idea that, the gospel of Jesus liberates you from all of these things. And it's time for you, rather than to receive, it might be time for you to give, and time to support someone else in need. So we have to get back to that. At the base level, though, Simon, I just want to make one more comment about this, and it just draws from something you said earlier. I still think the only resource in Western civilization that can renew what I would call a kind of a civic humanism — I'm using humanism in the positive sense, not the secular humanism, but what we would have called a Christian humanism. The only force in our society that can renew that now is the church. Like, it's the church that's going to be the memory in Western culture of what it means to truly be a human being. And that's quite a responsibility for us, but it's one we need to think through, pray through, and actually take seriously, because at every level of our society, we're being dehumanized. And that's happening, and it shows up for youth and young people and children first. That's who gets hurt the most, but it's happening to all of us. And the church is the one place where, I totally think if you're a church and you're dehumanizing people, you're still buying into that model of people exist to serve something bigger than themselves. No, they exist as ends in themselves. And so we need to, as Christians, remind ourselves of that. It's people over programs. The people don't exist to serve the program, to serve the machine. That those programs exist to serve people, and the church is one place that's remembered in Western civilization today. But there aren't too many others where it's remembered.
Just want to tease out that dehumanizing element, but I'm getting, again, for viewers to understand that you're talking, obviously, if all you're doing is running programs without thinking about the people, if you are having a non-relational view of the world, again, it's all about self. If even in a church is sort of pushing perpetual victimhood, you're seeing all of those as dehumanizing tactics. But are there other specifics, if you will, or other dynamics we're seeing within society, be it in Australia, New Zealand, around the world, that you also see as dehumanizing?
Yeah, I think the fact that our stories aren't taken seriously anymore. I mean, by definition, to be a modern, enlightened Westerner or a liberal mindset today, to have that mindset is to assume that the only story you have is the story that you gave yourself when you first had no story, And it's that refusal to remember that I was born to two people, in my case, Frank and Sheila. I was born to actual concrete human beings who had stories, and some part of me, a very major part of me, emerges from their story, and that is somehow part of my tradition. Neither of my parents were really active. My mum's a Christian today, but neither of my parents were really active practicing Christians, but still a very large chunk of my worldview came from them. And I can only make sense of myself to a large degree through understanding that I see the world rightly and wrongly through their eyes, and there are things that I probably had to undo through seeing the world through their eyes. But it's knowing that as a human being, you're actually a real being with a story and a history, and that's really, really important. But what the modern world is designed to do is really rob us of our own identities. I mean, in our own peoples, and our own. You think about all the people at the moment, Simon, that are getting on these small boats and crossing the channel, and of course everybody's angry about all this mass immigration, all these problems and stuff. But I just want to just hone in for a moment and think about what it would take for a person to leave their village, let's say, or wherever they are in Africa, get on a small boat and go to some far-flung country. It means the abandonment of relationships, family, traditions, all the things that mattered to you. And why is it happening? Well, it's happening because they'll do stuff cheaper in London than we can get someone currently living in London to do it. So they've been dehumanized in the process. We call them, illegal migrants or small boat people or whatever. But at the end of the day, they're as much a victim of the system as anybody else. And, their story is no longer matters. They've just become a cog in this gigantic, how do we make widgets cheaper? Well, let's get rid of the group that expects to be paid, 15 quid an hour, and we'll find a group that can do it for 5 quid an hour. And the gutting of the factories that we used to have throughout Australia, America, Canada, and shipping off to China was all part of that. And so we just need to face the reality. There's a lot about the modern world that isn't that healthy and doesn't cause us to flourish as people. And I see it all the time here in Australia because the cost of living has gone through the roof. I mean, if you'd been in Australia 10 years ago, it was probably 25% cheaper to come to Australia than it is New Zealand. I doubt it's cheaper today anywhere in Australia. I bet it's more expensive than New Zealand. And people are feeling it, and it's hurting. It's hurting people. So there's just a lot wrong. And but I think anything starts with a recovery of personhood, human being, relationship, story, family, connection. I mean, these are the things ultimately that we live for more than anything.
I think that migrant one's a really good example. I mean, it's quite a political issue, not so much in New Zealand, as you know, because we're so far away. But one of the things that strikes me in the debate, be it in America or certainly in Europe, is that dehumanizing by reducing individual humans into a category, as you say, they're boat people. It's like, yeah, that's true, they are, but there's hundreds of thousands of them, each with an individual story, which is something that we need, I suppose, is the church to keep speaking into. We can debate the political reality of it, but they're individual human beings. So there's a challenge there. I was just struck, though, jumping back, and I'm going to badly paraphrase this cardinal, but it was around the whole church's place to build society, because I think we believe that we do have a good foundation. It was a guy called Cardinal George who talked about, look, I will die quietly in my bed. My successor will be pilloried in the public square, and his successor will be killed in prison. But then his successor will rebuild society. And I've probably badly paraphrased that, but again, it's that little bit of a theme that's always through Christianity, right from day one, persecution, and yet once that persecution, if you will, ends or society implodes, the church is still there to rebuild. And I've always found that, probably badly paraphrased by me, but really important. The church cannot give up on its mission here in society.
No, and look, our whole history, if you think about the collapse of the Roman Empire and what kept learning alive was, a bunch of Irish monks who brought the gospel to many, many pagan people groups and actually kept, the written documents, even elements of the classical world that Christianity didn't agree with. But these guys kept it alive in their monasteries simply by copying by hand the great texts and the great books that survived from the carnage of the barbarian invasions of the Roman world. And so, we've done this before. We've kept a civilization alive that was well on its way to death. And I just think in this time, we're small and fragile in many ways, but I just think in this time, humanly speaking, this is the great task before us. I think there's a nice one too in terms of, I'd call it civic friendship. Any of the classical philosophers are going to tell us that you can't have a society unless there's some modicum of friendship at the core of the citizens. No matter whether you vote for that party or that party, there's still got to be a core value of friendship. And traditionally, we've had this in Australia and New Zealand. The citizens might have voted for different parties, but they didn't go out and kill each other on the street over it. They respected that there was a friendship at the core. I think that's been badly damaged, and we're getting away from it. And as our problems have gotten bigger, and Simon, you've been in politics, so there's no point me telling you anything about this, but I don't know. I think you'd probably agree with me. Our politics is drifting further to the hard left and further to the hard right, and the middle is disappearing. But it strikes me that one of the things that Christians can remember for everybody is that friendship is at the heart of life. And if we're going to be citizens together in a democracy and have any hope of pulling that off, we're going to have to find out again what it means to be friends with one another in the public square. And it strikes me the church is a great place to learn how to be friends and to make friends quickly and to make new friends. And part of what I said in the Substack, of course, is that to me, the centre of church life today is not where the altar is. It's or not where the pulpit is for Protestants. It's it's the foyer, because that is where the new person who's completely afraid, like going into this foreign experience, is like it's like being a Philistine and going to the art gallery, where there's going to be all these terrible foreign experiences, and I'm not going to understand why they're bowing or why they're lighting candles or whatever they're doing. But at the end of the day, look, we need to now make our foyers a place of relationship, and it's really the centre now of church life, because the truth is that people are coming to our churches looking for hope, looking for, some form of salvation, however they understand that. And it's our responsibility to help them find it.
The modern project has left a lot of disappointed and broken people. A modern world that says just fulfill whatever you want for self and it'll all be fine. And actually, despair, loneliness, anxiety, we're seeing that prevalent. Unfortunately, we're seeing that certainly through the statistics and our younger ones in particular, but also the adults. But then that's where the church needs to step in and say, look, there is a message of hope here. So I like what you wrote and said about the foyers, because it takes a lot of courage actually to come into a church. I'd add it's not just the building and the history and the bowing and candles. It's often to our language. I mean, we know what we mean. We talk about the blood of Christ, this, and redemption, that, and the cross of Calvary. But for a lot of other people, it's all a bit mysterious. So again, your Substack seems to emphasize. It can be very much gobbledygook. What on earth? But that relational element that's right at the door. And as I read what you wrote, it was probably pushing it a little bit further. Is actually the foyer is where the front door is. You always have to be at that door to gather people in, to call them in, because some will step in of their own volition, but the church needs to be calling. That's an essential part of its work.
I think you need your friendliest people now almost in the parking lot and greeting people and getting them into the foyer. It's intimidating for people, but yet people are coming, and it's a beautiful thing to see people. I mean, we baptised 5 people last night at the river in Noosa, and these are all people who've been recent converts to Christianity. And, look, it's just endless now, Simon. And we're just seeing, we've talked about this, I guess, this whole podcast. But, people have been drawn back to church as the one place where they might find hope again. But it's now on us as Christians who were once those same people. I was once the guy at 16 who was looking for hope myself. And so I know now to take responsibility for helping other people find it. And it was a great privilege to baptise that lady, Heidi, yesterday, who 12 weeks ago came forward in the church and gave her heart to Jesus, So, I mean, that's the journey of Christianity. We've all been on it. And I reminded her last night when we baptised her, look, each of us, it's a weird experience to have to go into the water like that, particularly in public with all these people that you don't know. But actually, each of us has had to take that journey and become part of the body of Christ. And it's a wonderful thing. And I'm so excited for the church, because I just feel we've been kicked around for so long, and we were really kicked around during that period you talked about with the letter C, which we won't mention, but we were really kicked around. And I remember reaching out to you at times for advice about how do we cope as pastors with all this stuff that's going on. And you were very sage to give us great advice. But I think our moment in a funny way has dawned again. I guess that's what I was trying to say in the Substack, is don't be discouraged if you feel. The funny part is, mate, in Australia, of course, every state is different. I live in Queensland. It's quite a conservative state in many ways, and we still have a conservative government up here. I think it's the only one in Australia, funny one, maybe Tasmania as well. But we have a state called Victoria, which everybody knows where Melbourne is. We call it the People's Republic of Victoria, because it's basically some sort of version of the CCP in Australian form. It's become almost a one-party state. It's been 27 years, bar 4 of Labor government. Ironically, I would argue that's the place where the most interesting forms of Christianity are arising in Australia. It's the place where it's actually most hostile. You mentioned Tertullian before, and the blood of the martyrs is seed. But it turns out that when we have interesting forms of atheism, we get back interesting forms of Christianity. And when our Christianity is boring, we produce boring atheists around us. So I think that it's interesting that where Christianity is most threatened, it's actually at its strongest. And I'm really interested in the differences of the Victorian Christians and their courage in standing up in certain ways when there are many laws that they could get tripped up on. So you can't really make a comment about Islam today in Victoria without likely getting dragged before some tribunal, if not the courts. And you could find yourself in jail. And there's many other things you couldn't say. In fact, I suspect we're getting to the point where there'll be certain Bible verses we won't be able to read. I reckon that's the Sunday we should all get up and read them, by the way. No, don't take my advice. But
no, I'm actually with you. I think actually Christians need to stand up and be bolder. The Christian message is not for this amorphous concept of church which sits outside of us. Each of us is the church, and
this is our life. This is our people, and we're the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we're the brothers and sisters of Jesus Christ, and that cannot be forgotten. And I love these classic modern Christians, Simon. You know them better than me, but the person who says, I believe Jesus is Lord, but that's just my opinion. It's like, no, that's not an opinion. That's a fact. If you're a Christian, the fact that Jesus is Lord is not an opinion. It's a fact. And it's a fact.
It's the faith of the church. It's something which I always love the Latin word tradition, which means, traditio, means to hand on. And one of the things of faith, and it's a grace and a gift, but in sense that the teachings of the faith are handed on. It's a patrimony which each of us, you and I, and in our families, are to guard, to build, and then hand on to the next generation. I didn't come up with this story.
You know what? And it's true. And we don't know better than our tradition either. And that's where the humility of faith comes in. That I was reading the Bible with a friend of mine who just became a Christian about a year ago, and we sit and do Bible study together. And we've been doing Genesis. And so this 7:30 this morning, I said, mate, do you want to take a break from Genesis? We've done 37 chapters. How about we try something else? What would you like? I said, well, let's do Romans. So we got into the first chapter of Romans. And I pointed out to him that Paul talks about the obedience of faith. Very unusual language, but he basically makes obedience a synonym of faith. And it turns out that faith is a form of obedience. It's the submission of my life to the Lord who is above me, who's worthy of, who gave me my existence and is worthy of all my love and affection. And so there is such a thing as the obedience of faith. And it's a beautiful thing to submit yourself to a tradition, to admit that there are people smarter than you who formed that tradition that you should not gainsay, you should not question, you should not argue with. You can dialogue with, but don't argue, because, at the end of the day, to have a tradition is to receive a mighty gift. That's an incredibly precious thing. And of course, the modern world's been at war with tradition, since the Enlightenment. And, that's been our story.
Well, C.K. Chesterton talks about it as the democracy of the dead. It's sort of a very simplistic or simple but profound argument around conservatism, and that you don't just go and toss out the decisions of the past without deep reflection, because, that's the democracy of the dead. We've built our institutions in a certain way. And it's certainly one of my observations, Craig, and in modern political dialogue, although it impacts the church, that, if we're doing it this way, we have to get rid of it. It's like, that makes no sense at all. I mean, in some cases it will, but I just always have loved that phrase, that democracy of the dead. I thought I'd just actually raise one last quote with you from one of my, no relation, but her name's Flannery O'Connor, and I thought actually in some ways it echoed a bit of what you had written, but she wrote all those years ago, "If other ages felt less, they saw more, even though they saw with the blind, prophetical, unsentimental eye of acceptance," which is to say, of faith. And in the absence of this faith now, we govern by tenderness, and a tenderness long cut off from the person of Christ and now wrapped in theory. I just thought it was for me, just echo what you had written.
It's a profound quote. And look, I've been living in New Zealand for a long time, along with you, and we were subjected.
Then you had to escape.
We were subjected to a very long stint of what some of us call weaponized compassion. And, the truth is that it didn't help New Zealand, and New Zealand is struggling under the weight of that burden today to some degree. But in a therapeutic age, we've learned to trust our feelings and not our thoughts and not faith. And I think Flannery O'Connor's giving us some sense of that, the modern human being is feelings driven. It's probably why we should stay off social media, by the way, because it just inflames rage in people who are already, addicted to rage. But we need to start using our heads again and start doing what the Greeks told us and starting to use our practical reasoning. And to some degree, you've got to get your feelings under control if you're going to reason well. And look, the church again is a school. for learning how to feel rightly about things. Part of having any virtue is learning what to feel and to feel in the right way at the right time about the right sorts of objects. And so we need to grow up in our feelings, and there's too much talk of feeling in modern Christianity, again, because of those separations we talked about at the beginning, because it's all the modern world's left us. It didn't give us truth. It said it had the truth and science had the truth. All we were left with was religious feeling. And that's not enough. The truth is the church has the truth. What we have received in the gospel and has been handed down to us by the tradition of the fathers of the church and the prophets of the Old Testament and the apostles is the truth. And it's not just any other way of seeing it. It's not just my little private view on the universe. It's actually public truth. The gospel is a bigger story than any other story the world tells. And every other story can be included into the gospel story because it explains what's wrong with human nature and what would fix it and what has fixed it in Jesus Christ. So, we need to be confident again as Christians that we live in the biggest story that's ever been. It's the most truthful story. It makes sense of the most number of facts. And the story that we're told by the modern world is shot through with lies. And the reason I know that is because people keep coming back to church, knocking on the door and saying, I want the truth. And that means they're admitting they've been living in lies. And I hope that's what the Substack was about.
Oh, it was, and I think actually that's a great place to wrap it up. Look, we could talk for hours. I mean, you're an Aussie, I'm a Kiwi. We both studied theology. This is just a short dip in the pool. We could be here for hours, but no, it's a good place to wrap up. But remind people again, Craig, where they can find your Substack and, of course, your website as well.
Yeah, so faithmadepublic.substack, they'll find me there, and I write reasonably regularly 3 or 4 times a month at least, and hopefully more as we go forward. And faithmadepublic.com is the website, and if they want to find out, if you're a pastor out there or you're involved in the church and you want to find out about doing the seminars that we do or whatever, just go to our website and register some interest there, or get in contact through my Substack, and we'd love to be in contact and relationship with anyone that's interested.
Well, Craig, I'm loving the work that you're doing now in this new space. I have to say, it's probably not a bad place to do baptisms in the river of Noosa. I could think of worse places. But no, look, thanks for the discussion today. As I say, I was quite taken by, well, actually all your Substacks, but this one really just impacted me, and I just thought it was a great opportunity to speak. And I really just want to encourage our viewers and listeners to, check out Craig's Substack, look him up on faithmadepublic.com and engage. And Craig, great to have you on the show.
Thank you, sir. And love your work too, Simon. And thanks for everything you've done for Kiwi Christians, but Kiwis generally. You did a lot of yeoman's work and heavy lifting across the years, and a lot of people admired you for the work. And so thanks for keeping it going in this space. You've been an important voice, and you are a very important voice in New Zealand. So God bless you, mate, and your beautiful family as well.
That is very kind of you. I would send New Zealand cash over as a thank you bribe, but it's worth nothing compared to the Australian dollar. Anyway, have a good one. Thanks, Craig.